try might be to avoid argumentation. This is where tact and using I messages becomes very important. Trying to force somebody to admit something can certainly trigger resistance. At the pre-contemplation and contemplation stages, you're providing information in the most loving way possible. And I'm not saying this is easy. You may need to practice first before having that conversation. You may need to talk to a counselor, talk to a trusted friend, maybe call your sponsor. You may need to practice by writing to diminish the anger that may make it very difficult for you to communicate what you need to communicate in a supporting and loving way. I know that that sometimes has proved quite challenging for me. Another possibility might be to roll with resistance, which means it's important that the solutions to the problem come from the person with the problem themselves as much as possible. Common sense would say that we're more likely to do what we promise to do if we have had input into our behavior and behavioral change. So if somebody acknowledges your concerns, you can say something like, well, what do you think you need in order to change? Or how can I support you? If they continue to have objections to changing, remember to stay empathetic, that what you may be asking them to do is very hard. We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we'll learn more about things we can do and ways we can actually produce change. Welcome back. Well, we were discussing different techniques we might want to use to encourage people we love to make changes that feel like they're important to us and that might help the relationship. The next thing we could try would be something called a support self-efficacy, which simply means that we're more likely to make a change if we believe that that change is possible. It's the belief that we would actually be able to perform or accomplish the task. Often, if we see a path toward change, it's helpful to meet with at least one other person who has successfully made that change. That helps encourage us, and that's one of the reasons that support groups and 12-step groups actually can be very, very beneficial to people. Sometimes, simply because we know change is possible, we might feel doubtful, and it helps to actually have another living person who we know has already made that journey. Somehow, maybe it underscores the possibility for us. Now, once a person has decided that they've made a decision to change, one of the things that's important for us to do is to recognize their intent to change, support changes in their thinking, and to recognize progress that they very well may have already made. Too often, we ask for a change, we get distracted, and we never acknowledge change when it happens. For example, let me share with you a common conversation that I will often hear in my counseling office. He might say, "She drives me nuts when she leaves her wet towels on the bed. I hate that." And she'll say, "But Bob, I haven't done that in a month since you brought that up in counseling." And he might say, "Well, I guess so. We'll see if you can keep it up." Now, obviously, if that's the kind of support we're getting or lack of recognition we're getting, we're not going to be very encouraged to stick with our behavioral change. So it's important for people around us, once we have requested somebody to change, that we notice that they're actually doing it. Most anybody responds well to positive reinforcement, and to have somebody we care be a cheerleader for us and acknowledge us and acknowledge our efforts. Now, the other thing we can do is discuss a plan. The shift in conversation might move to that we finally have acknowledged the changes we need to make, and we've accepted that we need to do it, but then sometimes we can get stuck in how to do it. We don't have to, as the person who requests change, design a plan of action for them. You need to keep that in mind. Again, the best plan is to solicit ideas from them. What are they willing to do? Ask questions like, how do you think you might do that? Who do you think we could talk to? You have to respect that only they can actually make that decision and actually make that change. Some of us have been caught in that trap of doing our best to manipulate, negotiate, pressure somebody into doing what we think is best for them. And by and large, most of us have experienced some defeat. The truth is, the most respectful thing you can do is make a request and let the person do what they need to do. Now, another possibility we might decide is to communicate free choice to the person. While we're having this discussion, it's important to acknowledge that not only does the person have a responsibility for change, but they have the choice to change. Really, all we can do is be supportive. So we need to keep acknowledging the reality of the situation. The reality is that it's always up to them. Really, the only reason any of us changes is because we encounter a motivation, too often it's pain, that propels us forward. Somebody else having pain because of us may help initiate us to contemplate it, but most of us are not that altruistic. There needs to be a personal reason that we've decided to move forward. The other thing we can do is talk about the consequences of their action or their inaction. It's important for the person to be clear about the negative possibilities or consequences if they don't change. For a more complete picture, you can also talk to the person about what they fear changing. It's very common, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about maintenance or relapse, that we'll make this important change that on the surface really does seem positive, and then there'll be this undercurrent or backlash of other behavior. Well, maybe we know that intuitively. Maybe we know that, let's say when we got married, that there was an unspoken contract, which is perhaps the marriage will stay intact as long as I don't bring up anything that is painful or makes the other person angry. I sort of understand that from the beginning, even if it's not verbalized. I know that if I decide to become more assertive, I decide to change this about myself, at some level, conscious or unconscious, I know that that means there's going to be a change in my relationship. And I could be really frightened about exactly what that might cost me. You know, when I train students and interns and we talk about disclosure and informed consent at the beginning of counseling, one of the things I always mention to them is to make sure and mention the risks of change, because they're always there. There's no way you can change and not impact other people. It's sort of a ripple effect, where they say every alcoholic affects at least 6 to 7 other people, who affect other people, who affect other people. You know, when we talk about nobody's an island, I think that's a perfect example of that. Most of us cannot just change in solitude, and other people will likely have an opinion about that. One of the things I help people do, encourage them to do, is do a pro and con sheet. Very simple. Often we learn to do this in school, you know, where you draw a line down the middle and you put positive benefits of change, and then you put what might be the consequences of change. Some of those negative consequences might be temporary. One of the things I tell people is when they're first, for example, learning to set limits or tell other people no, that initially other people won't like that. It's not like they say, "Thank you for refusing me." Okay, most of us don't do that. However, what they find is if they're consistent about it, very soon people adapt, and it stops being a problem. So often if we can tolerate the anxiety of the initial shift in the relationship, it actually settles out and becomes more positive in the end. It's important not to get panicked. Now, the other thing we could do, if we want to be supportive to somebody, is offer information or even advice. You know, the person contemplating change may actually need additional information to make a decision to move forward. Perhaps you can figure out together where the best place might be to do the research. Maybe there's somebody you need to call, or maybe there's a support group or some reading that might be possible. Again, keep in mind that the person themselves needs to do the research. All too often, I will meet people who have thoroughly researched in the library, in the internet, and in books and in magazines, and come home with a stack of reading material for their loved one to review to convince the person that they have a problem and that they need to do something about it. And as you can well imagine, frequently that material either goes unread or becomes a source of strife between the two. Most people don't appreciate having somebody come in with a stack of literature to show them what their problem is. Most of us would rather do our own research, thank you very much. So we need to be careful that we may be trying to be helpful, and what we may actually be doing is alienating that other person inadvertently. And in fact, at that point, they may become stubborn and not even wish to have the conversation at all. So as much as possible, you can give information, you can give advice, and then you have to do, as we say in recovery, let go. You gotta let it go. Now, let's say we've been successful. We've communicated our concerns. We've said, this is what's bothering me, honey. Well, at that point, we then begin to look at how to make a change plan, a plan to actually negotiate this change. One of the questions we might ask ourselves is, for example, the changes I want to make are, and then we begin to list them. And I encourage you, when you do that, to be as concrete as possible. You very much need to know the specifics. Often our mistake is we're too vague. People will come to counseling sometimes, and I'll ask them what's troubling them or what they feel like they need to work on, and they'll say, everything. Everything is large. It means everything about them as a human being, which is impossible and not even desirable, okay? So a lot of what we need to do is spend some time and thought really honing in on specifically what it is we would like to do differently. Now, the next part of creating a change plan is maybe to ask ourselves the most important reasons why I want to make these changes are, and to be very sure that these are changes that we have decided, and the reasons that we have decided are important to us. I mean, all too often people will say to me, I really need to change this thing about my personality because my children don't like it, or my spouse doesn't like it, or my partner says they find it annoying. And that's important information, but that often may not generate change. Most of us have to have a very private and a very personal reason. And sometimes we don't even know what it is. I was talking to various people before I did this show and asking them, you know, at what point did they know they needed to leave a relationship? Or how did they know it was time for them to change careers? And most people talked about this sort of vague click, this sense inside of themselves that it's time to move on. There are a few more questions that it might benefit us to ask. Things like the steps I plan to take in changing are, and again, as concretely as possible, list them. The ways other people can help me. And then again, you become very specific about the kind of information and support you need. Be objective. I know my plan is working if, and make sure that you have some clear objectives and goals, and then be sure to consider things that could interfere with these plans. What kind of things could get in your way? Anyway, I want to thank you for stopping by tonight. Hopefully this will be helpful information to you. Be with us next week. I'm Mary Crocker Cook. Good night.